Hey everybody, hope you're doing great today. In this video, I'm going to talk about aquarium pumps. Basically, what are we using aquarium pumps for? How do you go about picking an aquarium pump for your aquarium, as well as the equipment that goes along with an aquarium pump, such as sponge filters, decorations, and the tubing as well too. So your basic aquarium pump, something like this, I actually purchased this from a hydroponic store. It's usable for hydroponics as well. I've got a hydroponic setup for a couple of plants in the basement that I do use a pump like this. And these are standard pumps, so whether you're buying them online from an aquarium store or you're buying them locally, they're pretty much standard. So the main things you need to look for is the sizing of the pump. Basically, how big your tank is, how many tanks do you want to power with your air pump, and what exactly are you powering. If you're just wanting to drop an air stone in your tank and have some circulation going on in there, then something simple, smaller pump will work fine. You just need to make sure that it's sized enough for your tank. With some tanks, you get the deeper, larger tanks, then you usually will need a stronger pump in order to pump air in those, especially as you drop those air stones towards the bottom. The pressure is a little higher over there, so if your pump can't keep up, it's not going to pump any air or very little air, if at all. So as I mentioned, these pumps are pretty standard. You're going to have an AC outlet. Plug it in, it's going to start pumping right away, and it's going to run into airline tubing, something like this. This is a large bundle of airline tubing. I'm working on a fish room in the basement, so I needed much more. But for one tank, if you just got one tank and you've got one air pump, usually you're not going to need more than 10 feet worth of air tubing. And the air tubing is standard, the size is standard. So when you're going to your aquarium store or you're buying online from an aquarium store, they're usually going to be compatible with any brand of aquarium air pump that you're buying. And even the ones you buy from say a hydroponic store, they're also using the standard airline tubing size, as well as the air pump has a standard output that will work with that airline tubing. So the air pumps can be used for a number of different things. It can be used just for simply aerating the tank, putting an air stone on your tube, dropping it in the tank, and just all you want is some additional aeration in there and some additional circulation. It takes the water from the bottom as those bubbles go up, that creates a flow, and that water from the bottom goes to the top of the tank, which helps with aeration. Now you can also use a sponge filter, something like this here. Basically the airline tubing connects in the top over here. You put it at the bottom of the tank. So not only does it provide for the circulation to the air bubbles, it also allows for filtration of your tank. So basically this is a sponge filter. As bubbles go up, water is pulled through this sponge over here, and so any debris that gets caught up in there will remain trapped. So periodically you clean these out just to get rid of that debris. But this also becomes a biological filtration method. So basically the bacteria will attach itself here. As the water flows by, it'll grab onto nitrites and ammonia and basically convert that, the final product being nitrate, and that nitrate gets put into your tank. This is another way of filtering your tank if you didn't want to use a mechanical filter. So if you did want to power more than one tank, you can do that. It's also going to depend on the size of the pump. You know, in that case, something very simple like this is good for maybe a 10-gallon tank, no more than a 20-gallon tank. But if I were going to do multiple 10-gallon tanks, multiple 20-gallon tanks, I'd want something bigger than this. You can get some pumps that actually have multiple ports, so you can plug in a couple different airline tubes. The most I've seen on some of the smaller ones, the standard ones, are 2 ports out, so you can power 2 tanks directly. But what you can also do is you can also buy a splitter. You can run the airline out on this pump to the airline input on your air valves. So basically you can have multiple valves on there. You'll have an input and then you'll have 4 or 5 outputs, 4 or 5 or more outputs, depending on how many you need. So each of those outputs then has their own little valve in there, which you can control the amount of airflow. You can shut it off completely if you don't need it, or you can turn it on fully, and then you have multiple of those. So you can daisy chain those. That means basically you can run multiple airline tubes into multiple valves, and the valves can serve different tanks. Now, same thing going back to the sizing of the pump. If you're running multiple airline splitters, multiple airline splitter valves, then you need to have a strong enough pump that it can feed all those valves and feed all those tanks. So one great thing about running a sponge filter with an air pump is it's easy to get a battery backup air pump. So in this case, I purchased this from Amazon. I believe it's no more than $10. It runs off a couple of D batteries. It'll run for probably 24 hours, 36 hours. So in case my power does go out, I've got 2 filters in here. I've got a mechanical filter that's run off of the AC outlet. I've got the air pump that's running my sponge filter in the corner over there. So I don't have a battery backup in this system, but if the power does go out and I'm worried about the circulation in there, worried about the filtration in there, I can go grab this, pop in a couple D batteries, plug it in directly into the Airline that's feeding the sponge filter, and let it run, and that's going to make sure my tank remains cycled, that there's some circulation going on and there's some oxygenation going on in the tank, and then less risk to my fish of suffering from ammonia poisoning or nitrite poisoning. So by having an air pump filter, the battery backup solutions are much easier, much cheaper, versus you're trying to buy a battery backup for an AC mechanical filter. Those batteries are generally going to be more expensive, they're a little more complicated, they need to be charged properly, they need to be maintained properly. So that way when you do actually need it, it's ready to run and ready to go. And you also need to understand the ratings of those. Basically, can the battery run the mechanical filter for as long as you need it to run? What's your time frame? It depends on things too, like, you know, how long is your power out? What's the average power outage? In our case, we don't have it that frequently. One time recently, there was a power outage where it was out for about 24 hours due to a downed tree. So that's the rarity. It usually doesn't happen like that in my area. So, I did have this ahead of time. I purchased this, and I've got a box of D batteries. So I just quickly grabbed this, plugged it into the Airline over there, and then it kept running the tank, and so I didn't have to worry about the circulation and the aeration of the tank. Now your Airline tubing can come in different colors. I've seen it clear, I've seen it in black, I've seen other colors. I've got some clear one here I purchased previously, and then I've also got some black Airline tubing that I'm going to probably use some in my fish room in the basement. And really some people don't like the clear because it does show the algae that's growing on it, and if you don't like that, then with black it would be less likely to be seen. So when it comes to sizing your air pumps, basically just look at the brand. You're going to your local aquarium store, buying online, just check out what the ratings are and will it work for your tank. Now if you just have one tank or two tanks at most, you can get by with the on the shelf stuff. So this is a Tetra Whisper air pump rated up to a 60-gallon tank. And the nice thing about some of the pumps built for aquariums is they're designed for quietness. Especially if your tank's in a main area, you don't want a very noisy air pump, then look for some of the Aquarium branded pumps and just check what their noise levels are, read the reviews, versus you're buying some of these, in which case this is for a hydroponic setup. It's a little more noisier than what I would consider acceptable, but in this case it's in the basement. So it's out of sight, out of mind. I'm not hearing anything, it's not bothering me. But if this were in the main room over here, I'd want a quieter filter compared to be something that's gonna be a little more noisy, a little more distracting. So what about those of us who want to set up something that involves more than one tank or multiple tanks? In my case, I'm building a fish room downstairs in the basement, but if you've got 10 tanks or more and you need something to run air in those tanks, it's actually gonna be a little cheaper and a little more effective if you have an air pump. If you're running air-powered filtration versus mechanical filtration, it can get pretty expensive to buy multiple in-tank filters, the mechanical filters, versus your $5, $10, $15 sponge filter. I can drop 2 of these, 3 of these, depending on the size of the tank, and I'm not going way over budget compared to mechanical filters, where the mechanical filters, some of the quality ones, $30, $40 minimum, depending on your tank size. If you're going canister filters, you're looking at $200, $300. So to run an entire fish room, run multiple tanks, it doesn't make sense. It's not financially feasible for many. So the pricing with those mechanical filters can get pretty high, and saving money is a great thing in my opinion. So running something like a sponge filter saves some money, you still get the effective filtration, and your fish are happy too. So for those of us who are running fish rooms, who are running multiple tanks, you need something like this. This is basically a large air pump. Now the tube size on this it's much larger than your standard Airline tubing that you're using to go to the individual tanks. But what this is doing is from this point, you're connecting it into some other sort of piping. In my case, I'm going to be running PVC piping. This will be running into the PVC piping, and then from the PVC piping, I'll be installing these metal air valves where the standard clear tube will be plugged into that directly and then run into the tank. So with this, you can run up to 45 tanks. It's going to vary though. There's no specific science, there's no specific formula that says, okay, you have this, you can run 40 tanks. It depends on the size of the tanks. If you have 40 10-gallon tanks, I'm sure that'll run it pretty easy. But if you have 40, 125 gallon tanks, then you're probably going to run into some challenges because those are much larger bodies of water, and that might strain the filter. So it's going to vary. It's not an exact science, like I said. This one is good for 40, 45 tanks, depending on the size, depending on how much water you have in those tanks. They do come in different sizes, so if you need to power more tanks, you can buy larger ones. The nice thing with this too is you can run a couple of them together, so you can put the input on this on one end, put another input on the other end, and you've got your PVC line running around up on your ceiling or wherever you are behind the tanks, and that will feed all those tanks. You've got so many tanks now that it's not running air to the end of the line. You're having issues running air there. Pop in a second one, feed it into the other side over there, and that will help power all the tanks equally. So that's all I have for this video. Please hit that like button so others can find this content as well, especially if you find it helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.